Thank you. Let me also. Um, haven't heard from Iowa yet, so maybe she'll be here, maybe not sure. Jennifer did text us say she was out, and I think that's the sum total of us for now. Um, so thank you for continuing to show up. We're 4 weeks in now, and today will be our first actual lesson on observation. We're going to spend 2 weeks talking about observation, 3 weeks talking about interpretation, 2 weeks on application, and 1 week on correlation. Those are your four primary aspects of good biblical interpretation or hermeneutics, um, observation, interpretation, application, correlation. These are the concepts at their highest level that we want to kind of wrap our heads around. We spent the last 2 or 3 weeks really kind of going through just some very foundational things. What is hermeneutics, and where does hermeneutics fit in the big picture of, theology, and what are some of the resources and different, things that I can use to aid in this process? That was last week. So far from a kind of in-group exercise standpoint, we've been reading Philippians. We've been trying to get to a summary of each of the chapters, trying to get to a summary of the book itself. And this is all part of this interpretive spiral where we read broadly, and then we read specifically, and we read broadly, and we read specifically. And we do this to overcome the paradox of, in order to understand any specific passage, I have to first understand its context in the overall book. But to understand the message of the overall book, I have to understand the sum total of all the little passages. And so this is a bit of a paradox, and this is also why it's very difficult and not practical to try to just jump right into a particular verse or passage, because you don't have the context, and it's really hard to interpret something well when you're not fully in the know of the context for it, which we'll learn more about in a couple of weeks here, a few weeks. So we're using our interpretive spiral to iterate through the process and chip away at this, well, I think the book means this. I think this is the theme. I think this is the main point he's trying to make. And for each of these chapters, this feels like, the summary or the key point he's trying to make in each chapter. And today we're going to start to do a better job of observation. And I was trying to think of some metaphor or some good word picture to really help explain the importance and value of observation. And I know I've made this statement in the past that you cannot interpret well what you do not see well. That is a very true statement. You can also think of it this way. Observation is about seeing the pieces of the puzzle. If you only see 50% of the puzzle pieces, you will struggle. Even if you put all of those 50% together, you will not have a holistic picture. And so you will struggle to interpret the picture well because you only have half the pieces. Observation is what gives us the pieces to the puzzle. It is the primary driver that begins the interpretive process. And so the extent to which I can observe determines the puzzle pieces that I have to work with when I start doing my interpretation. That's the simplest picture that I could think of in regards to why observation is so important. It's really easy for us to just gloss over this because when we're doing it, it kind of feels like I don't understand the relevance of this. But as we get into interpretation, where we're turning the corner from what I see to what does it mean, having all of these pieces that we can put together helps drive meaning, helps us understand the meaning. So observation is about finding puzzle pieces that we can put together in a meaningful way during interpretation. We're going to spend 2 weeks talking about observation. Today, we're just going to talk about some kind of top level or high level things to look for when we read. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about what is known as a unit of thought, which is the way they kind of wrote back then. As you probably all know, Paul did not write in chapter and verse numbers. Right? Matter of fact, the Greek didn't even have punctuation in it. It was just a long string of letters that the readers and the writers knew how to digest because of the context of what was being written. And they would use what we today, who knows what they called it, what we call today a unit of thought, which means it's very similar to our notion of a paragraph. Typically, a paragraph contains a holistic thought. And each paragraph has its own little thought, and you may have 2 or 3 paragraphs that make a bigger thought, kind of thing. Same kind of concept, and we're going to dig into that more next week because we've been doing things like chapter summaries, but what we really need to do is get to a unit of thought summaries, because the unit of thought that's what allows us to follow the flow of the author's writing. We have to understand what are the different units of thought, and for each unit of thought, what was the thought? What was he trying to say in that? And some of what we're going to learn to observe today will help us understand where a unit of thought may begin or end. Because again, in the Greek, it's just a bunch of letters. It's not like they didn't even write like we do today with, indented paragraphs or some clear visual indication that I'm starting a new paragraph or a new unit of thought. So they used things like repeating phrases or repeating words, or they used things like inclusios, which means I start my unit of thought or my thought process with a phrase, I say a bunch about it, and then I end with that exact same phrase. And an inclusio is just like a bookend that means everything in between there is a holistic thought. That's a common, technique kind of thing. Or they used certain literary structures like a chiastic structure, which is that A, B, C, C, B, A kind of structure. We'll talk more about that as well, to designate a unit of thought. There were different literary devices that they used for that. So what we're going to talk about today is a little foundational. Next week, we'll get into a unit of thought, all of which will help us continue to gear towards interpretation when we get there in a few weeks. Angie, just help me remember that before we leave, we need to talk about the social. The social. Right now on the calendar, October 13th, we have a social scheduled. I have a suggestion for it. Just want to toss that out, make sure everybody's okay with it, and then we'll go from there. Okay. Before we jump into this, any thoughts, comments, or questions about what we've covered so far? I know last week was probably the, shall I just say, the most boring content we had to go through. It was just a bunch of resources and things of that nature and some software, and it was necessary, but not exactly fun. But any thoughts or questions about anything we've covered so far? Have you, let's see, I don't want to put people on the spot. Is everybody making progress in summarizing the chapters and getting to a summary of the book?
you're talking about unit of thought, and when you go through a chapter, um, there are, like in Philippians, I think it's in the fourth, fourth chapter, is quite a few, as I would call them, movements, like
Right.
from talking about one thing and then changing it to something else totally different. And that's probably where it might become more difficult to come up with a summarization of the chapter.
Yeah. Because there feels like a lot of different thoughts in a given chapter.
They don't look obviously related.
Yeah. Yeah. And to that point, this is why being able to identify the writer's thoughts and the movement between the thoughts. So typically we talk about a unit of thought as just, the paragraph, if you would, just to put it in words we're familiar with. Whereas movement is the flow between units of thought. How does the author's writing flow or move? So we can see his progression. And depending upon the literary style or genre that you're reading will determine a lot about the expected flow. And we're going to talk some about literary genre here in a moment. But obviously, if a chapter has several thoughts in it, it's a little more challenging to be concise on a summary.
Especially in 10 words.
Or 3 to 5.
Okay.
Yes, I feel you. And, for now, it's more valuable to learn the skill of summarizing in a sentence or two than getting it down to a handful of words. Right. So start with a sentence or two. And the more you kind of get into it, work your way towards less and less words.
As I was trying to do that exercise, chapter 3, because it's a whole lot of.
3 is probably one of the harder ones in there too. Yeah.
It just hit me like, he wrote a letter.
Yes.
If this is a letter, it's not the same as if we would write a letter. We wouldn't necessarily just write one train of thought all the way through.
Yeah, right.
Right, through the letter. So it's like, okay, that helped me. But yeah, 3 is tough. I didn't get down to 10 words. I'm sorry.
So to today's information, what is observation, right? Very simply put, is to ask and answer the question, what do I see? The skill to develop in observation is our ability to see more. I've heard many stories from professors, because this topic comes up in multiple classes, who talk about Howard Hendricks was a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, wrote one of the books that we're using for some of this content called Living by the Book. And he taught a class on hermeneutics, and in his observation, he would have them, he would give them homework to say, go, do observation on this passage. And I forget what the passage was. It was only like 10 verses or so. It wasn't very big. And they would come back and they would talk about it in class. And over the years, he kept a list of all the unique things that were discovered or observed in the passage. And in a few short verses, his list was well over 100 things. So I assure you, you can never spend too much time in observation. It is a honed skill for sure. And, fortunately, as we already know about the biblical text, there's a lot that we can learn just at a pretty high level or casual reading of it. But I assure you, there is an immense amount more with some effort and diligence to it. And a lot of that is just beginning to be exposed to what are the different kinds of things to look for. Because in the absence of knowing some different things to look for, you just don't see them. So we're going to introduce a few of these things. Psalms 119:18 is a good passage. Just open my eyes that I may behold wonderful things from your word. It is a deep mine. You will never be able to observe it all, but we need to observe more. So the process of observation follows the interpretive spiral. So the first thing is read the whole book, right? This is why we've been doing this since day one. Start by reading the whole book. And then in that initial reading, you want to try to at least answer the question, what is the literary genre that I am reading? Now, that's probably apparent just by where you are in the Bible, right? If you're reading the New Testament, there's a good chance you're reading what is called an exposition or a prose discourse / letter. Although you could be reading bibliography or narrative if you're in the Gospels. It could be different things. But one of the first questions you want to try to answer is, what is the genre of literature that I'm dealing with? So I listed exposition or prose discourse or letter first because that's what Philippians is. Philippians is a letter. It's prose discourse. This is an exposition. An exposition is, a straightforward argument or explanation of a body of objective truth. This is kind of your academic answer. It is a form of writing that appeals primarily to the mind. The argument usually has a tight structure that moves from point to point in logical fashion, right? That's your units of thought and the movement or flow between them. A large chunk of the Bible is narrative and or biography. Much of the Old Testament is narrative. Narrative just means it's story-based. It's told like a story. Now, we are not going to go through all of these questions here. I simply wanted to provide you with a list of things to think about or to help drive your observation skills when you're reading this kind of literature. So if you're reading about a story, things you need to pay attention to are, what's the plot? And there are some questions you can ask to help uncover the plot. Who are the characters in this story? In what ways is the story true to life? These are just a handful of questions that are relevant, to think about if you're reading narrative. Parables. We all know Jesus spoke frequently in parables. A parable is a brief tale that illustrates a moral principle. A parable kind of sneaks up on you, blindsides you, if you would, bypassing their defenses and appealing to their imagination and their hearts. It compels them to see some aspect of life in a completely new way. Jesus often used parables for that very reason, because it enabled him to challenge people's thinking in a creative and constructive kind of way that wasn't so, debate oriented or argumentative. And it, made it easy to see for those who wanted to see and frustrated those who did not want to see. Poetry, another big type of literature. The distinctive feature of poetry is its appeal to the emotions as well as the imagination. One of the main features of Hebrew poetry is the extensive use of parallelism. Hebrew, if you read like the Psalms and the Proverbs things, you'll see a lot of this 2-line parallelism, 3-line parallelism, where they'll say something and then they'll tweak it or slightly change it in the second line. And the second line is adding detail to the first line, kind of thing. Part of me has thought for a version 2 of this class or something, we might do something like a Psalms or a Proverbs, or do something to try to incorporate a poem or a parable or something a little different. Because for Philippians, we're really only staying in the world of prose discourse or exposition. Another key to appreciating the Hebrew poetry is to recognize their use of hyperbole. This is the extreme or exaggerated language that makes its point through overkill. One of the things that I handed out is a list of figures of speech. There are 25 on that sheet. That is a fraction of the actual number of figures of speech. They are probably the most common forms of figures of speech, but there are literally hundreds of them. We talked briefly last week about the value of understanding the use of figures of speech, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Proverbs and wisdom literature. A proverb is a short, poignant nugget of truth, typically practical and often concerned with the consequences of a course of behavior. One word of caution. A proverb contains a principle, but is not a promise. This is challenging for many of us who may have been raised in a tradition that quoted proverbs as if they were promises. Right. Yes. Exactly. A proverb tells you this is how life basically works. What is left unsaid is the qualifier, but it doesn't always work this way. Not 100% of the time does it work this way. And that's fairly evident if you have ever read Proverbs and then flipped over a few books to Ecclesiastes. You would be like, these guys clearly did not get together when they started writing this because they sound very contradictory. And that's really highlighting the meaning of this little statement that Proverbs are principles. They're not promises. And Ecclesiastes is the book that kind of helps us recognize that they're principles, not promises. Because Ecclesiastes is the book that says things still go wrong. Prophecy and apocalyptic. The role of the prophet in Scripture was not so much to tell the future, but to proclaim the words of the Lord, not to foretell, but to forthtell, as someone has well put it. Right? They were God's mouthpiece. They spoke on behalf of God. Sometimes that included future, but that wasn't the purpose of a prophet. The purpose of the prophet was to simply deliver the message. In reading the prophets, it is critical that you recreate the situation. It is absolutely critical that you bombard the text with the 6 questions of selective Bible reading: who, what, where, when, why, and wherefore. Answering them will give you an invaluable database for considering these additional issues. What is the main problem that the prophet is addressing? What images does he use to describe it? What is the response of the people? What does this prophet's message tell you about God? What happens after this prophet delivers his message? Why do you think God included this book in his word? You can see that the different forms of literature have different ways of observing, different questions you need to ask when you come to that kind of text. This is why the very first thing we need to understand when digesting a book is what's the primary literary genre? And then even within a book, there may be poetry or parables that, typically the whole book is not a parable. A parable is just a type of literature in a book. The book might be narrative or biography, and it contains poetry or it contains parables. And then apocalyptic simply means to reveal. So when we talk about books like Revelation, or we talk about books like Daniel and Ezekiel, these are apocalyptic in nature. Apocalyptic does not mean, contrary to our current day mentality, the end of the world. That is a modern day expression of apocalypse. But biblically speaking, the word for apocalypse simply means to reveal, to uncover what was once hidden. So books like Daniel and Ezekiel and Revelation are uncovering mystery. They're revealing things or trying to make things clear.
Book of Ephesians mentions it multiple times, mystery,
Yes.
Paul unraveling mystery, which, Tim Mackey talks about it.
Yep. We love Mackie. Good stuff. Okay. This list, Roman numeral 2 there, is probably the main thing that we're going to utilize in our exercise today. So we'll spend a little bit of time in here. These are some of the really foundational observations for us to work on. Now, some of these you can pull from the text, but it really just depends. Like if you go to the book of Hebrews, it's hard to know things like who's the author. So some of this is evident in the text. Sometimes you have to do a bit of correlation. You have to look at other books like Acts. Most of you are probably already aware that the book of Acts is really the history book of the spreading of the church. Many of Paul's letters speak about events that were also recorded in the book of Acts. All right, so you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which talk to, the person of Christ. And then you have Acts, which is the birth and spreading of the church. And then most of the epistles, Paul's and Peter's and John's and all, often have a root or a foundation or at least some connection to a story or an event that was discussed in the book of Acts. So we want to ask questions like, who is the author? Philippians is very clear who the author is, and it kind of mentions a co-author, Timothy. Who is the audience, right? Who is this being written to? Now, depending upon the type of literature you're reading, that can vary based on the unit of thought that you're in. Because, for example, in the Gospels, Jesus is often addressing different people. So depending upon the text that you're reading, you'll want to ask who is being addressed for this passage. Because throughout the book of Matthew, many different people are being addressed. Right? There's not always a notion of one audience kind of thing. Although even for the Gospels, each of the Gospels was, like Matthew was written to a Jewish audience at its broadest sense, kind of thing. So understanding who that audience is helpful. Background setting. Where were they writing it from? That's called the provenance. Where was the author at the time they were writing? Do we get any understanding of geography? Any places mentioned? Any chronology? Any dates mentioned? And what's the occasion? Why is it being written? These are a little easier when we're dealing with prose discourse or some of the New Testament letters, because they tend to follow a pattern in which they give us most of that content. Number 4, really, really important, things that repeat. This comes back to the fact that they didn't have grammar, they didn't use paragraphs, they depended on literary devices like repeating words to mark the beginning and ending of a unit of thought, to indicate that they're switching gears and going to talk about something else. To emphasize key points. They would use repeating words, repeating phrases. That's a really big literary device for them. So it could be a term, a phrase, a clause, a character, an incident, a circumstance. Many different things can repeat. And in our exercise today, we're going to do some hunting for repeating things. And then things that are related. This is very nuanced and can get, this is one of those that you can just observe for a long, long time in any given book and probably not exhaust all these different things. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg kind of list. These are the primary things. But things like a movement from a general topic to a specific topic, or the other way, the author starts with something very specific and then he goes to a more broad mentality. This movement from broad to specific or specific to broad is to note or take note of. Questions and answers. Do they pose a question and then answer a question? Cause and effect. And there are several different types of cause and effect. But in general, if you see the word because, you're dealing with some kind of cause and effect, more than likely. And we want to take note of what was the cause and what was the effect. And sometimes you get the effect first and then the cause, and sometimes you get the cause and then the effect. Comparisons. I was trying to think of some good comparison words. I know contrast words like but. Comparison words might be like or as.
What about therefore?
Therefore is often a cause and effect. And I would also say that sometimes a word could be used in different ways. So it might be a cause and effect here, might be a contrast over there. But I have found it helpful over the years to kind of develop a list of keywords that I look for, buts, so that's, therefores, in order. These are really important phrases to be familiar with. So comparisons, contrasts, any expression of time, I was gone for 3 months or 40 days or whatever, anything about time. Figures of speech. Oh my goodness. We could spend weeks just talking about figures of speech. Again, the handout I gave you has 25 fairly common figures of speech. I just wanted to have one example at this point to share that's relevant to Philippians that helps make the point about the relevance of understanding a figure of speech. So, I'm sure everybody can quote me Philippians 4:13. Anybody care to just spit that out top of your head?
That I can do all things.
All right. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. What do we think that word all means in that sentence?
Anything.
Right. Most of us would just think anything, especially if all I have done is yank out that one verse. But if we look at 4, 10, 11, 12, leading up to it, we see a very specific list of things that Paul was dealing with. Specifically, where he was talking about learning how to be okay, whether I have a lot or whether I have a little. These were the things that he was referring to. So in Philippians 4:13, that is actually a figure of speech known as a synecdoche, which is where you take the whole as representative of the part. And you can do it either way. You can take the part as representative of the whole, or you can say something like, I forget the verse quote, but it's like their feet caused them to sin or took them into sin. That's a part representing the whole. In Philippians 4:13, the use of the word all is a figure of speech in which he uses the whole to represent the part. So what he's really saying in Philippians 4:13 is I can do all of the above listed things through Christ, which may be a bit different than, how our traditions have taught us.
So do you know how many coffee cups people are gonna throw out now?
I guess if he had says, therefore I can do all things, so you got to go back and realize that, okay. And a lot of people don't reach about the above, they're just.
That's right.
All things.
Yes. So we have both a context issue and we have a figure of speech issue. One, we need to interpret a passage within the context that it's being utilized, within its unit of thought. And secondly, to the point of the value of figures of speech, a figure of speech can help us properly interpret or better interpret so that we don't walk away from a passage like Philippians 4:13. I can do all things, and think all means everything. All does not mean everything in that passage. It means all of the things I mentioned above, kind of thing. He was using a figure of speech, a bit of hyperbole, although it's technically called a synecdoche, which is in your figure of speech list as well.
Interpret that as meaning I can do all things that Christ gives me to do.
The question you'd have to ask is, can you interpret it that way and feel like it holds to the context that it's in? Because ultimately, and we're going to really hammer this hard when we get to the 3 weeks of interpretation, interpretation is driven first and foremost by context. We always say real estate has its primary rule, location, location, location. Interpretation has its primary rule, context, context, context. If you are interpreting a passage in a way that exceeds its content or is less than its context, we should think harder about the way we're interpreting the passage. Things like similes, metaphors, irony. Metaphors are probably your most common type. I didn't want to take a ton of time going through the list, which is why I took some time, and I had a handout or two on figures of speech, but I didn't like the way they were organized and they didn't have good examples. And so I kind of reworked it to what I gave you. They're grouped properly, and everyone has at least 1 or 2, sometimes 3 examples to help with that. Because I know before I started any of this, I couldn't tell you what a single figure of speech was. I couldn't even really define what a metaphor was, and that's probably the most common form of figure of speech. Yeah.
Feel that certain Bibles, when they give the information, they send 1, 2, 3, like life application.
Yeah.
Bible gives you a
Yeah.
slew of information that in most cases is
Yeah.
pretty good.
Yeah. I'm all for, matter of fact, one of the things I'm going to show today is how to use Blue Letter Bible, just because that's the one I'm more familiar with, to look up some of this kind of information in an introduction. Right? Remember last week we went through resources. Everybody loved that. We had lots of fun with it. Introductions are the type of resource to help with that question. Background, author, date, who are they writing to, why were they writing, all of that is typically in an introduction. And sometimes study Bibles have a little introduction with some of that content already in there. Like with anything else, it's probably a good idea if you have access to more than one resource to compare a few different. Because if it's not explicitly stated in the text, somebody's having to extrapolate. So it's just good. And fortunately, those don't typically have a huge impact on your meaning, on the interpretation process. But still good to know. Okay, so all of that was kind of, as we start to go through and read, as we're reading the whole thing through, what literary genre am I in? What are some basic questions to ask as I go through that? It's going to be an iterative process, so you don't have to get all of this answered the very first time you're reading through it. But that's a pretty good list, but certainly not exhaustive, but a really good list. Man, if you can just knock a handful of these out, especially repeating things, cause and effect, comparisons, contrast, those type things, bullets 4 and 5 and 7, Those are probably your key pieces. If you can get better and better at observing those, you're going to do much better. So, second reading of the whole book, we're starting to build out chapter titles, right? This is the summary, summarize the content of each chapter, give each chapter a title. Now, we've talked about doing a sentence or two. In the classes I had, it was 3 to 5 word title for the chapter, which is similar to what we had mentioned last week, the pericopes. The pericope is, in many of your Bibles, there being an italicized heading, and that is the translation committee's summary of more likely a unit of thought, because there's not just a summary for the chapter. They tend to do them at the unit of thought level. Then third reading, the whole book. This is where you're starting to develop the theme, the summarization of the book, written as a complete sentence. These are a few examples, right? So Matthew, the theme of Matthew is Messiah's redemptive ministry and kingdom offered to Israel. Clearly, that does not encompass everything that's happening in the book of Matthew. But again, remember, the purpose of the theme sentence is it acts like a compass. It just helps us stay kind of true north when we're trying to interpret a passage in the book. We want to make sure that we're not interpreting it in such a way that it violates the theme of the book. And until you know the theme of the book, or at least think you have an idea of what the theme of the book is, you can't even do that kind of validation. Right? So this is all about, in order to iterate, we're building boundaries. Acts, the theme of Acts is the birth and building of the early church. Notice these are all very short. I even put my summary of Philippians in there, and clearly it is longer than the other two. This enables you to think biblically on issues related to that topic, right? It's all about building a frame and doing your best to stay in the frame, or through your iterative process, learn to adjust the frame. Okay. Flip to your, no, don't have time. I was going to show you just a couple of things in the figures of speech, but they're pretty self-explanatory. So, here's what we're going to do. First, I want to spend just a little bit of time on this topic of using an introduction to learn some of the basic, who's the author, what's the occasion, where's the author writing from. And so I just wanted to show you using Blue Letter Bible. I didn't even try this in Bible Hub, so you and or Stephen, because Stephen uses Bible Hub, will have to tell me if, I'm assuming there's an introduction in Bible Hub, but I did not look. So I'm going to go to study, and you can see under Bible reference, there's introductions. And there are a handful per book. So I'm going to go down to Philippians. Okay. So for Blue Letter Bible, all free, didn't have to buy anything. You have a handful of introductions that you can utilize for this. So for example, if we just kind of go through a couple of these, J. Vernon McGee, he attributes Paul as the writer. He pegs it around 62. He thinks it was written at the same time as the book of Ephesians, one of the prison epistles. City of Philippi was, who it was being written to, and he gives you a little bit of information about that and some more information about the church. The occasion, this is why. Why was it being written? He thinks there are two specific circumstances that occasion the writing of the epistle. Key points, and then just some general remarks. Introductions should feel different than a commentary, because he should not be interpreting passages. He should be providing background information. This is why it's an introduction typically. Now, in some introductions, they will have a on the book of Philippians, they'll say, here's the background information, but then they will get into like an outline. And for the outline, you have to do a little bit of interpreting. You have to do a little bit of this, what we think the structure is, kind of thing. So let's look at another one. Let's look at one from John MacArthur.
Keith, I'm sorry, to interrupt. Where are you pulling this from on Blue Letter?
Yeah, blue letter, go to the word study. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it looks different.
Yeah, the phone will look different. They do have an app, by the way.
So once you do the study, you're looking at
Introductions. And for anyone who has a laptop, feel free to bring it. Go to introductions. And then once you're in introductions, you're going to have to scroll down to Philippians. Right? And there's basically like 5 or 6 different introductions. We'll look at John MacArthur's introduction. You can see he's even got it structured in the way we would expect. What's the title, the author and date, the background and setting, the historical and theological themes, any interpretive challenges in the book, and what's the outline. That is very stereotypical of what you get in an introduction. Right? So he would say, Paul wrote Philippians. He doesn't mention Timothy, at least not yet. And looks like he's pegging it somewhere around 60 to 62. And he's talking a little bit about imprisonment. What you will learn as you read through some of these different introductions is the most contested or difficult thing to answer about Philippians is, where was Paul when he was writing this? It is most commonly held that he was in prison in Rome. But Paul was in prison a couple of times in different places, actually 3 different times in 3 different places. And so, because Paul doesn't specifically say the city, he does give hints like the Praetorium Guard and Caesar's Palace and things like that, that would certainly seem to be Rome, but he just doesn't outright say, I'm in Rome. So there's, we don't know. Yeah, to my point earlier, whether he was in Rome or somewhere else really doesn't affect your interpretation and the meaning all that much. But it's good to understand to the best of our ability where he was when he was writing, because that helps us understand a little bit of his circumstances, maybe a little bit of his mindset at the time. If there's a fact to not understand, this is one of those not that big a deal. But to the extent that we can know, it's helpful to have this kind of information. And this is why there are introductions as resources to use for this, because people have already put a lot of thought into this. But even as it is with commentaries and interpretations, if you have 10 different introductions, you're going to have some variations across those. For example, one of the introductions that I like to use, only because it was required textbook for us in school, was this called The Cradle, the Cross, and the Crown, an intro to the New Testament. So it's only New Testament. And you can see in their key facts for the book of Philippians, they date it closer to 59. Still covering the time frame in which Paul would be imprisoned. And they do think it was from Rome imprisonment. So it's handy because it's a very common format. I like this because they just kind of give you the bullet point list. And then if you want to learn about any one of those, you can come down here and read about all the, the could be's and would be's and might be's of the author. Okay, so introductions. A good tool and resource just to gain insight into the background of the book. especially if it's just not 100% clear in the book itself. Not something you need to spend a ton of time on, but helpful to have. Okay. All right. I have put a lot of thought in trying to figure out what would be the best way for us to do this exercise. Stephen and I even had a conversation about this as I was trying to gain insight. Here's where I settled. I don't want to just say, okay, take the next 30 minutes and find everything you can that's repeating in the book of Philippians. Because if everybody starts in chapter 1, we probably nobody will get all the way through chapter 4. So we're going to divide and conquer. I'm going to split you into groups. Each group's going to take a chapter. And in the chapter, you're going to look for repeating words or phrases. That's all I want us to focus on right now. Just repeating words and phrases. We'll keep it really simple. We're going to do this exercise first for that. And then if we have time, we may do the exact same thing again, but look for figures of speech. So we have 4 chapters and we have how many people? 8, 9. We have 10 people. Let's see, 3, 3, 3. So if I put you in groups of 3, that'll cover chapters 1, 2, and 3. And then Sir Edwin, can you just like deal with chapter 4 by yourself?
Yeah.
Because if I split into 2s, then that's not going to work either. Because then we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups. Okay. So we'll let the guys work together. If maybe you can spin around and work with Ellie and Kenise, and then Angie and Ginger and Kathy. So we'll start chapter 1. Ellie, Kenise, what's your name? Mary. Chapter 2, the guys, chapter 3, I'm giving you the hard one. And Edwin, chapter 4. Yeah, ideally use the handout that I gave you last week or this week. That way you can literally circle, underline, you can mark up the page. And everybody use the New American Standard. That way we're all singing from the same song sheet. And I'm going to, repeated words or phrases, either way. And I'm going to do like I did last time. I'm going to put a timer on the board to give you just a little bit of nudge. We're just going to take 10 minutes. This should not take long just to hunt for some repeated words. You can ignore things like a and the. Don't worry about those. We're looking for words that you think are significant. And you can either work on it individually and then compare notes, or you can work on it together. I don't really care. We'll figure that out. When you're all done, we're going to then compare notes and put a list up on the board here.
First, do it. Maybe we just come together. Find out. You okay with that, Don? Okay.
The timer has begun. 10 minutes. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you 10 minutes to work on it individually, and then I'll give you 5 more minutes to compare notes as a group. Or you can use all 15 minutes as a group, however you want. That's okay. Come on in. Halfway through the 10 minutes. And I will want a count to go with the words. Sorry, sorry, sorry.
I give it some more minutes now. We got how many minutes? Okay, all right. On the back end.
We use the chat.
That would be a smarter, not harder approach.
I asked it, I said, please list all repeated, words. And then asked me, well, you want 2-word phrases and 3-word phrases? Then I said, okay, please give me all 3-word phrases. And it shoots it all out.
Yeah.
It's that fast.
That fast.
Although I missed one.
Yeah. Yeah, I tested it the same thing. I just said, show me all the repeating words or phrases
Okay.
in the book of Philippians. And
Yeah.
it gave me a table with words, and then it gave me a little table with phrases.
On that, the other app, the literal word, it also highlights all words, and then you can highlight it again, and then show you all the verses.
That's great.
Yeah, I'm going to show, I'm forced.
Little word is the,
That's what I was busy reading.
Logos is about to add AI to their software, which is going to be really nice.
yeah, this is the,
Because then it'll be trained on their libraries.
the literal word. It's what I would, yeah, now, so you highlight what they start shooting out, and then so you aware how many times. That was, and SAP.
Most of the free ones out there do a really good job.
Yeah, okay.
About a minute left in your 10 minutes. And then if you feel it would be helpful, I will give you 5 more minutes as a group to compare notes, do your counts. I want to know how many times each word is used. If you think it's repeating, it better be at least 2.
Okay, I'm thinking that is,
Okay, 5 more minutes. Yeah, the boys aren't communicating very well with each other. Pair notes, you got 3.5 minutes.
And then share my, share, you can share my dream, just let me share it. And then,
Flesh, 3 times. Beware. The word loss. Loss, LOSS? Yeah. Twice. Did you say resurrection, Don?
Twice.
Twice. Now, there is a phrase here that's used at least 3 times, confident in the flesh.
Verse
Yeah.
20, concern, and verse 28.
Real obvious, the verse 7 is a contrast. The word but.
We're only looking for repeating words.
Huh?
Only looking for repeating words.
That's it.
That's it. Just repeating words. But I appreciate the extra effort.
You need an extra point on it.
Gold stars.
Lost. Did I say lost?
Edwin, have you talked amongst yourself to?
If you see me fighting them,
Yeah, then I'm worried. 1 minute.
crazy. I put down a list of figures of speech and it starts spitting it all out.
Oh, yeah.
That's really.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, it's, again, when Logos gets it embedded, so it's using their more tuned library, it's gonna be amazing.
At least twice. And
I think it's all good.
Found
You know, and people have always said that,
Knowing
well,
Christ in
you
verse
know,
8.
using the internet is like cheating. You just have a lot of superficial knowledge.
in verse
And it's
10,
true, but if
You
you
know
do
him?
your deep dive, you get so much more out of it.
Mhm.
You know?
Yeah, and because generative AI is able to,
I'm
I mean, you can't go to Google and say, give me a list of figures of speech in Philippians.
Yeah, it has.
You won't do it unless it finds a source that's already done it. And then it'll serve up a link to the
Covers
source.
that kind of nuance.
But
knowing
with
and being
AI, you can literally say,
Yeah.
you know, tell me all the figures of speeches
But
that are.
what
in
I'm
Philippians.
saying is like, you can use all this stuff, but if you don't know what you're looking for.
Yes,
So that's still the value of you still have to prepare, study,
yes,
like
yeah, doesn't do you much good.
you can't say like, okay, well, college students or graduates now are less than those that were in the past. They're using these tools, they still have to put down the groundwork and prepare
Right.
all the basics, and then they use
Right.
tools.
It's just, the tool is just enabling a much,
It's better.
hey, Wes,
Yeah, need to look through the door.
that's it. No problem, man.
The word suffering. twice.
Yeah, it's just,
It's better tools.
it's just better tools.
Yeah.
Verse 8 and verse 10.
They certainly can be abused.
Yeah.
Or attempted to be used as shortcuts.
Yeah.
But you use them effectively, they're just better tools.
You wanna count it? No, yeah, okay.
Okay, time is up. Okay, chapter 1 team.
I knew that was credit for.
No.
Okay.
what is your highest hit word?
The highest one would be Christ Jesus or Jesus.
All right, so Christ or Jesus. Did you do that as two words or one word, like Jesus Christ, or?
I did Christ and Christ Jesus. Anytime I saw those.
Okay, so Christ or Christ Jesus.
And I got 17 in one.
Okay, so if we put them together, you got 17.
Yes.
Okay.
Other. If the conduct or proclaim Christ, conduct in manner, I did those separately, so I don't know if that means we should.
Gotta be the same English word. Should be the same English word. Or it can be like pray, praying, prayer.
Pray, I have 3 times.
So,
Just pray. not
right, I want
prayer.
all the variations of pray added together. So like pray, prayer, praying are all the same root word.
Okay.
So I've got a proclaim,
Okay.
I've got 12, but I think there's more.
Proclaim 12.
And then conduct, basically, or a form of that. I've got 13
Okay.
plus, I don't know, I lost count.
Okay.
And in imprisonment, I have 4.
Now for you other teams, because I know you're cheating and still working.
Here.
You,
I can hear it.
you should be looking at theirs, because here's the challenge in doing it the way we did it. Ultimately, what we want is repeating words across the book,
Right.
right? So you might not have thought a word was repeating because in your chapter it didn't repeat, but it repeated 3 times in the chapter before you. So all that to say is if you see something up here that you remember seeing, but you didn't add it to your list, make a note of that. Because we're going to try to accumulate over here.
3.
What? Pray?
Pray, prayer.
Because he wanted
Yeah, I want all the variations of
He's
it.
like prayer, praying. I just did pray.
Yeah, I did it.
So I'm going to say like 3 plus, because I know there's a few more in there.
I did gospel,
Gospel.
about 5, God. I got 6. Flesh,
Flesh.
I got 2.
More.
I didn't have a chance to
I
count.
wanted in part as pray, and then I had love, joy, because both of those were repeated, love and joy.
We didn't have a chance to count the other words.
Okay. So
And we just didn't have time to do.
The
So
counting.
with nothing more than this, you can already start to get a sense of what are core thoughts or themes or concepts in chapter 1. Right.
Conduct.
You're proclaiming, conducting,
On account of Christ Jesus.
right? Like Christ or proclaim Christ or act like Christ, kind of things. Prayer.
We had to add love and joy, but we didn't have time to tally them.
Okay. We'll put them down here just in case, because those are going to show up again. Okay, chapter 2. Say what word?
No, I don't know. I mean, we had 29 different repeated words. Repeating.
Like start with the most repeating word.
Well, we didn't tally that up.
Did you tally? You should know how many words, how many times a word repeats.
Each took 10 verses, so we're trying to pull it all together.
Chapter 3. Did you guys we can follow the direction. While chapter 2 continues to do their math.
Confidence 3 times.
Confidence.
How many is it? Worthless. Like, 20 times. Worthless twice.
What was?
Worthless
Worthless?
twice. We saw flesh 3 times.
Okay, so we have flesh over here too. Okay,
We saw beware twice.
okay.
Then we saw lost twice.
Lost,
Loss.
LOSS.
Yes. And we saw resurrection twice. Then we saw knowing Christ twice.
2 words, knowing Christ together.
Then we saw suffering twice.
Got anything more than twice?
Yeah, we saw God 4 times. And then I saw the word Christ alone 8 times.
Christ alone?
Yeah, just that word.
Oh, just Christ. Okay. How many?
8 times.
I think he's avoiding this one, circumcision,
Oh, yeah, real.
twice.
Twice? Any others? You got room for one more.
Um,
Nope. Tapped out.
word power, I think it's mentioned twice.
Okay, keep looking.
Yeah.
I
Give it
saw,
That's what power is twice.
brothers and sisters twice.
The phrase or?
Yeah, brothers, sisters. Then, in the Lord was 4 times.
In, what was it?
In the Lord,
In the Lord?
yeah,
And that was twice?
that was 4.
4 times, okay.
Circumstances, 2.
I'm sorry, work is 4 times.
Learned, 3.
Okay.
And then, according to ChatGPT.
So,
So you can look for words, but then there's phrases and everything, but,
Joy.
I guess the ChatGPT doesn't count. Those are what I got.
Okay. My chapter 2 team.
We back.
Okay,
But one of us
Gonna give you what we
dictate
have so far.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, just the top few.
okay, so. We wanna start at the top with the most repeated word, Jesus.
Okay.
Is that an actual number?
But you can.
Get along through. Between us, you don't have a number, but it's up there. Just put an arrow in it.
Greater than 0.
Right.
Or plus.
It's above 4. Yep. Work. Let's just say 4. Concerned. 3.
Love. Let's say more than once.
Death.
Death.
Yep. Twice.
And same mind, same love. The same is twice.
And then
Like same mind is a phrase, same love.
Yeah. Well. Never mind.
so erase that, put
Yeah.
rejoice. Twice.
That's good. That'll connect with joy.
Mhm.
We don't know how many joys there were, but
Hey.
Vain twice. Vain.
vain,
Greater.
VAIN,
Mm-hmm.
twice.
Service. Twice. So service, serve.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Share twice.
Share,
Sorrow, twice.
Joy twice.
I was saying, that we have rejoice
Rejoice,
twice.
joy, yeah.
Okay.
Same,
Oh,
Then
Yeah.
twice.
which one?
Sin.
SEND.
Send?
So there's send and sent. So how do you wanna?
We can put those together.
Sent, okay. So in that case, it would be. You saw it in yours too?
And just send twice.
Okay. Put 3 for send/sent.
Six twice.
Okay. Great work, everybody.
Our love is 2 and our joy is 3.
Okay. So a few things that we can see running across the board. We have flesh, joy,
Joy, rejoice.
rejoice, there we go, joy, rejoice. Sorrow and suffering, pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, like God, Jesus, we're gonna see that through most.
Yeah, that's the predominant word.
Yeah.
Words, yeah.
So, again, the intent and purpose of this little exercise is to begin to ask the question for my chapter summaries, for my book summary, are the repeating words that I'm finding supporting what I have for those summaries, or are they driving a potential tweak or adjustment to those things? So you can look at your chapter summary for each of your groups. If you got through all those, you could look at your chapter 1 summary and see, does your chapter 1 summary have any of these words in it? Does your chapter 2 summary have any of these words in it? Kind of thing. Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I meant to show that too. Oh, what that's doing. Or those on the video. Okay. That was the very manual way to do this. Let me show you a much faster way to do this. What we can do with, again, I'm just going to go to Blue Letter Bible. Okay, fine. So there's a search capability. So I'm in Blue Letter Bible, far left menu, search. I'm just going to click on search. A couple things you can do right out of the gate. One, I want to switch the version to the New American Standard, and I'm still old school and using the 95 version. Then there are some advanced options. We don't really want to look through the whole Bible, right? We only want to look through the book of Philippians. Right? So now we've set it to NASB and the book of Philippians. Let's say I'm in chapter 1 and I'm realizing I see the word pray a couple of times, or pray and prayer a couple of times. And I'm starting to ask, that feels like a repeating word. Let's see how many times that's in the book of Philippians. You can just type in the word and add a asterisk after it. It's called a wild card in search vernacular. Hit enter. And this will tell you there are only 4 total uses of it, 3 of which are in chapter 1, 1 of which is in chapter 4. So this is a good example of Edwin didn't list prayer as a repeating word because in his chapter it was only once. But across the book, it actually repeated 4 times. These search tools are immensely helpful with things of that nature. So, for example, let's do Christ. And there are 36 times in 34 different verses that it's used. I believe that is probably the most used word in the book. Let's look at a couple of the other words we had up here.
Can I slow you down for 1 second?
Yeah.
How'd you get it? I'm
Yeah.
in search. How did you get to those tabs?
So as soon as I executed the search, it took me into the search results. And the search results are where these tabs are.
Word search.
So I'll go back. So search. Well, I'm recording my screen so they can see. I say I am. Let me just make sure I'm still recording my screen. Share screen.
No, it's all right. I don't want to slow you down
No,
anymore.
Good. Okay. So back to pick the NASB and skinny it down to just the book of Philippians. And then let's pick a different word. Let's do, for example, proclaim. If I don't use the wild card, it's only the exact spelling and match. If I use the wild card, it should pick up any proclaims, proclaiming. So now we have a couple more. So you must have been including words like proclaim, but not the actual word proclaim.
So what did you?
What are the other words? Because you came up with 12.
Speak the word,
Okay.
preach, defense,
So
discover.
one of the things you can do is you can say, this should work pretty universally, speak or proclaim.
And you see that'll be
Read. And I can keep, if I have a list of words that I think are all conveying the same kind of meaning, I can just keep adding ors across here to, see if they're used broadly. Let's do rejoice. Let's see what happens if we just use joy. And we can see it only picked up joy, but we can see there's a lot of joy in there. Yeah. But then if we say joy or rejoice, now we have 15 times. This is another very popular theme in the book of Philippians. It's rejoice. If we look at, say, about suffering. Suffer or, well, here, let's just do suffer with a wild card and see what we get. 4 times, suffer, suffered, suffering, suffering. Again, across the book, 4, but only, chapter 3 has it twice. Yep. So really easy, really quick, skinny it down to the translation you want and the book you want. And then as you're reading, you can check the words, or you want to get really snazzy, you can go to ChatGPT and just ask the question. Here's the question I ask it. Using the NASB version of the Bible, can you identify all the repeating words or phrases in the book of Philippians and provide a count for each repeating word or phrase sorted by the highest to the lowest? And it gave me this little table. This is ChatGPT. Christ 37, God 22, Lord 15, Jesus 22. It did include some of the you and your and I and stuff like that, which is not really relevant, but like rejoice 9 times. Now, ChatGPT is pretty good, but don't ever, at least not yet, take what it says as just 100% gold. Right? It might be a good, let me go back through it and see if I can find those. And if I really wanted to be specific, I could go back to it and now say, okay, you said rejoice was used 9 times. Give me the chapter and verse for all of those 9 occurrences to have it listed.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Is there any value when doing this exercise, looking at the words that are not there? I happen to go back, yes, I was cheating with my phone, and looked up the word faith. And I think it shows up, if I counted correctly, twice in chapter 1,
GPT says 3.
well, 3, okay, but you don't see it anywhere else in the book.
In the book. Right. So this shows faith 5 times. 2 in chapter 1, 1 in chapter 2, 1 in chapter 3, or twice in chapter 3.
Yeah, and I had 2 in chapter 1, but just wondering, I don't know, I mean, if, for instance, faith didn't show up, but faith being a principle and most of what would it add value or something to.
I mean, I think the primary way that would be beneficial is the fact if he's excluding it from the conversation, you should exclude it from your interpretation.
Okay.
Right? If Paul's not talking about X, then your interpretation shouldn't include X.
Okay.
That kind of thing.
So don't add to what's not there.
Right. That would be eisegesis
Right.
instead of exegesis. One other thing that we didn't focus on here that would allow you to hone this down a little bit more is you can do this exercise with just verbs. If you do it with just verbs, that might give you a little more indication of the from an action aspect what he cares about. Just
Would you select the
it,
verb?
here in Blue Letter Bible, I don't know if you can, because I don't think there's a way in here to say and only verbs or just look for verbs. ChatGPT, I'm sure could do it. Matter of fact, if we just here to the bottom, let's say, where is it? List all the verbs that repeat in Philippians using the, did I spell that right? Philippians using the NASB translation in and sort highest to lowest. So the word be, which that's what kind of verb is that? That's a well, there's a name for that kind of verb. Is the most used one. But then you see things like rejoice way at the top of that list. Look at the other one, know. Right? So Paul's really emphasizing that you need to know something in this book, and you need to rejoice. Right, or be something.
Verb.
Be is a verb, yes.
That was your one.
No, it's a type of verb, and I can't remember. It's like
Copular.
that does not sound like what I was thinking. No, it's like a state. It's a yeah, it's a state.
B is the infinitive form, and B is the conjugate form.
Yeah,
That is used either alone or an auxiliary.
yeah, it's like be. There's a bunch of these state verbs that talk about the state of something, that kind of thing.
Is the next one have?
Yes, have.
and then no, you still got.
Whoa, too big.
Then looking at it, somewhere I know Paul said, I only want to know one thing about it, but I only want to know Christ. And in crucified, because he mentioned Christ, like they said, 17 times, and then he'll know, it's mentioned
12
12
times.
times.
And
You'll be part of that.
again, with something like ChatGPT, you could say, you could probably ask it something like, out of the 12 uses of the word know, what is it that he wants me to know? And it could probably summarize that pretty easily for you. Just to get a sense of what's the context. How's he using that word know? Now, again, these are handy tools, never to fully replace our own diligence in the text, but use something like ChatGPT just as a tool, just to help ask questions that, quite frankly, we have not been able to ask technology to help us with until present day. Because even something like Blue Letter Bible or even Logos did not have this kind of capability in it. Okay. We only have 7-ish minutes left, so we won't do the other exercise, but this was good. This gets us in the gear of repeating words and or phrases. Now, there was one repeating phrase, only repeated twice, both of which occurred in chapter 1, which I'm a little surprised you guys didn't catch. Now, I didn't explicitly say phrases. I just said words. Yeah, so I give you that. The day of Christ. It's mentioned twice in the first chapter. And it kind of begins and finishes a unit of thought as well.
So the repeating phrase has to be, how many words, what's the minimum?
Yeah, no minimum. It could be 2, it could be 10. It just needs to be the same set of words. Or extremely similar. It needs to convey the same meaning. The set of words should convey the same meaning. He may have slightly reworded it at the beginning versus the end, but it should convey the same meaning.
Did you do that on a chat GPT, or did you just?
Yeah, when I first ran this and I ask it to look for words and phrases, or this table is the words, but here are the phrases that it found. In Christ 7 times, in the Lord 4 times, grace and peace 2 times, and then here's our day of Christ. Actually occurs 3 total times in the book.
I found the words take hold twice.
Yeah.
So was that
No, it wasn't in this list. And again, there's some subjectivity to what ChatGPT does as far as what it considers repeating, kind of thing. And this will depend on the translation that you use, as well. Because if we did this exercise using your handouts for the New Living Translation, you might get a very different set of words, right? Because now we're dealing with a paraphrased version. I do suggest when you're doing something like this, stick with a more literal version. And if you really wanted to get fancy with it, you would actually do this in the Greek. And you would absolutely need software to help you do that. But the same kind of search we just did, you could do in the Greek. And most of them will allow you to, like if I go to just the word faith here, let's see if I can do it. I'd probably have to go here. No, I'll probably have to do it. I'd have to see if it would let me actually type it in the Greek. In Logos, you can actually do it in the Greek or the Hebrew. In Logos, it's even easier. I can go to New American Standard Bible, and let's say I want to do prayer. I can just right click on the word, go to its lemma, Remember, lemma means the root word, like run versus running. Run is the root, it's the lemma. And then from here, I can just say search on that Greek word. And it would just do the same kind of thing that we just did, but it would do it for the Greek word versus the English word. Because, as we talked about before, sometimes the same English word is translating a different underlying Greek word. So we may think that, what's a good example? Joy is 5 or 6 times. But what we don't know is that 2 different Greek words, 3 different Greek words, or is that 1 Greek word? Because if it's 2 or 3 Greek words, I can guarantee you each one of those words has a slightly different nuance that gets beneficial to understand.
Have you tried feeding the ChatGPT saying like, give us that according to the lemma? Can it do that?
I have tried getting it to do some analysis against the Greek, and it would not. So I don't know if it's just because I would think it knows Greek, but maybe it doesn't know Koine Greek, which is the specific Greek of the New Testament. I don't know, but I was trying to get it to do some analysis in the Greek, and it wouldn't.
You know, the root definition, then list the.
Well, you would have to, you couldn't give it the English word and then say lemma. You would have to give it a Greek word and then say lemma. Because if I gave it an English word, it would just do the root word of the English variant. It wouldn't actually do the Greek root word. So you'd have to start the thing in the Greek process. But Logos has the same kind of process where I can just say, look for the word pray. And it has nice little features where I can like align things differently just to make it easier to see. I can do analysis on it, all this kind of stuff. But so for the weekly suggestion of what you could spend some time on during the week if you wanted to, would be to pick a chapter or do as much as you want through the book and try to identify some of the figures of speech. And if you really want to simplify that, just look for metaphors. Metaphors are probably the easiest one to spot. You can get the definition and the examples of a metaphor in the handout I gave you. I can tell you based on another resource that I have here, I can show you this because it won't give away the answers, but just so that you can see, if you're wondering to yourself, how many figures of speech, Keith, might there be in this? Move. It's way out here. Did I add it? I think I may have added it here. This one, nope.
15 seconds.
Social, 2 Sundays from now. Okay, well, I'll just tell you, there's probably 100 or more figures of speech included.
In Philippians?
Yep. So just see if you can find a hand.
Okay.
Just look for some metaphors. There's plenty. Social, 2 Sundays from now, the 13th. Angie and I are actually going out of town that week, but we are coming back on Sunday. To keep this as simple as possible and not make it a burden on anybody, especially since Angie and I are going to be out of town, what I would suggest is that we just get together for dinner at one of our local restaurants here. Unless somebody has a objection, again, to keep it easy, the Italian place right across the street in Kroger called Antonetta's or Biba's is pretty, I mean, it's literally right across the street from here. And it's good food. And they got a big open space, so it shouldn't be hard for us to reserve a spot. And I think 2 weeks out, we shouldn't have a problem being able to reserve a spot for the 13 to 15 of us. And I would assume we can either do this exact same time, 4:30 might be a little early to eat, so we could do like 5 to 7 or, something that time frame. We may or may not need that whole time. You can eat and leave whenever you want. But
Or you suggested doing a dinner, or if everybody just needed a break and have the week off.
yeah, I debated on whether or not to even give the option because I don't want to make this awkward. I don't want a show of hands of, well, who just would rather not meet at all and who would like to go to a social. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Let's plan on dinner at Antonetta's at 5 o'clock. And between now and then, if you don't want to go, can't make it, whatever reason, just let me know. That way you're just telling me and nobody will be offended until you're not there that actual night.
I think right now, I'm good.
Okay.
You know, I'm gonna be out of state.
Okay. I'll just make a reservation for probably 13 or 14 since we know Edwin won't be here. And, so between now and say next Sunday, just email or text me or let us know if, you can't go, don't want to go, whatever. But that just felt like the easiest thing to do. And we'll just do dinner together and have a bit of a social and take a bit of a break. And then we'll come back.
That is break.
Yes, I would think that would be
Right.
okay. All right, sounds good.
Okay. Break. Thanks, everybody. Yep.
My daughter's